The dwellings and houses of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Queensland are extremely diverse through time and by region. Differences in styles, technologies and procurement methods have varied depending on local tradition, regional resources, climates and the political contexts of government and church policies in the remote institutionalised settlements and towns. However, two threading themes are evident within this diversity. On the one hand, the autonomous and persistent agency of families in organising their own lifestyles and environments to suit their customary and changing values. And on the other, the imposition on communities by government of a limited number of house designs to shape protection and assimilation processes. Our first slide is the only really contemporary slide that I'll be showing. It's a slide of rental housing for the indigenous staff of the Torres Strait Regional Authority on Thursday Island, completed in 2018 and designed by JDA Architects. The leading architect, James Davidson, commented to me 2 weeks ago that he was interested in the response of the indigenous staff because they had two very firm directives for him. One was to include these roofed outdoor areas where people could sit in hot weather or rainy weather and maintain external orientation. The second was the requirement for an underneath the house location for their hunting technology, their outboard motors, dinghies, fuel tanks and the like. This indicates a sort of persistence of customary behaviours. But we're going to wind back in history to the 1840s. The first houses for Aboriginal people were for the native police who'd been sent up from New South Wales. The native police were a paramilitary force who were trained to disperse and kill Aboriginal people on the frontier to allow the incoming squatters to establish their herds on the newly taken tribal lands. In a way, this was an anti-housing policy. However, at this early time in Queensland's history, when we were still part of New South Wales at this stage, there emerged a number of semi-autonomous villages in the 1800s. The Moreton Bay Penal Colony was only thrown open for free settlement in the 1840s. At that time, on Stradbroke Island, the people of Quandamooka were living in traditional dome forms, but starting to acculturate Western materials into their traditional housing. At Amity, there was a village of some 150 more Aboriginal people, a fairly sedentary village due to the abundance of seafoods, the big runs of fish that came through the channel there. A man from Manila arrived with the name Fernando Gonzalez to become a professional fisherman and dugong hunter, and he took two Aboriginal wives, Juno and Lizzie. And we see that they've adapted the housing there, the traditional housing. It's been converted into a European rectangular plan form, but they've retained the bark cladding technology, the traditional cladding technology. And this is where Fernando took up with his two wives and had 5 daughters who became the ancestors, some of the ancestors in the contemporary native title claims that occurred there at the turn of this century. Now from there, people moved to Myora Mission in 1892, which became another sedentary settlement. And although it was called a mission, in fact, it was there weren't any missionaries there. And again, we find the same type of housing style being moved and adapted from Amity to Myora, or Mungalba as it was known. And people earned employment or found employment in the Moreton Bay Oyster Company. An asylum had been established at where the town of Dunwich is today. The asylum took all of the misfitting people from Brisbane. It wasn't just for the mentally disturbed, it was for people who had alcoholism or chronic illness, or anybody who didn't quite fit into society in Brisbane. Employment also at the Peel Island Leprosarium. And occupation at Maiora continued right up to 1943. And this plan of the layout at Maiora, the notable thing is we see the houses of Granny Martin, Granny Finnegan and Granny Sydney Rowlands, who were only three of a number of matriarchs there. It was very much a matriarchal society at the time. The only white staff person there was the school teacher, and there was occasional supervision from the asylum medical superintendent. We'll come back to that in due course. Now, with the impact of the native police in Queensland, but also, and probably more dramatically, the impact of European diseases, the Aboriginal population started declining abruptly. And after a number of decades of debate in Parliament, it was decided to introduce the Aborigines Protection and Sale of Opium Act in 1897. And part of that act allowed for Aboriginal reserves to be set up, people to be moved into those reserves. And in the north, most of these reserves were put under the hands of missionaries. So we'll start by looking here at a number of missions, particularly in this case, the Mornington Island mission. And we have a excerpt from a book here about the first type of housing provided were children's dormitories, because the missionaries decided that their strategy was to separate the children from their adults and parents and relatives and provide a new form of moral education. They were particularly concerned about not only teaching the Bible, but preventing arranged marriages and polygyny, and particularly young girls going to old men. So the missionaries actually took over the job of arranging marriages. And here we have, I'm referring to a book by Elsie Ruffsey, An Aboriginal Mother Tells of the Old and the New, and her memories of the dormitory at Mornington Mission are clearly very much of a highly disciplined lifestyle with punishments if any directives weren't followed out. Here she talks about being locked inside the dormitory for periods of rest and sleep. And in fact, in her book, she likens it to slavery. Switching to Murray Island in the eastern Torres Strait, here we see the traditional beehive-shaped dome, Akur Meta, which was used at the time of colonisation. And here there was the London Missionary Society, who arrived in 1871, today celebrated as the coming of the light. These missionaries brought with them Polynesian assistants from the Pacific, and they too developed a rectangular cottage style, but retaining the grass thatching technology used on the traditional shelters. But the Polynesian workers also introduced other types of cladding technologies, in this case plaited palm leaf cladding held with bamboo battens, and also woven bamboo cladding onto a bamboo frame. This is as late as 1958. So we're moving from the 1870s through to the 1950s with these types of traditional thatching techniques. And switching to Yarrabah Mission, established in 1893 by the Church of England in the rainforest near Cairns. Again, a thatching style based on their methods of thatching their domes in the rainforest, using either bladey grass, palm fronds or paper bark. And here, this slide clearly shows how the palm leaves were turned into what are called wall tiles by weaving together the different leaves to make these vertical tiles, which were then overlapped and held in place with battens. Another mission, Arakoon, established by the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and here they used stringy bark, or what they call locally messmate bark, in large sheets in their traditional houses, which were like barrel vaults with curved sheeting over sleeping platforms. But they adapted this bark cladding to be used for rectangular housing in the mission. And people built their own houses, but the mission carpenter provided an ad-shaped subfloor with milled floorboards. Now, switching to another type of settlement pattern, since this is going to be the example of Djara, which we'll be showing from 1974, a pastoral and railway labourers camp 155 kilometres south of Mount Isa. And we'll be hearing the voice of Keith Marshall. Now, fringe camps sprung up simultaneously with towns all over Queensland in the 1850s. Towns were invariably formed on perennial, reliable water sources, but of course these were also important Aboriginal camps. And it seemed quite natural and obvious for Aboriginal people to maintain a camp near the town. They were allowed to do this because of the mutual economic dependence. The townspeople wanted labour. The town campers wanted to obtain products such as the new foods, clothing, tobacco, etc. And there was also, by all early ethnographic and newspaper reports, an element of some sexual services involved. And in Djara there was a camp at the West End. Now, under the Aboriginal Protection Act, people had to follow the directives of the police to work on pastoral properties or farms as labour, as indentured labour. Their salaries, they had very meagre salaries, but the pastoralists would pay that into bank accounts held by the local policeman, who was given the title of a local protector. And they were only allowed to get a voucher from the police station for food and clothes at the local store. So this is what's known today as the stolen wages case. In the West End, we find a range of people living there at this time. In this particular part of it, there were a rain-making clan from Olumpa, which is on Tobermory Station, and it was known as the Snake Gully Camp, taken from the Dad and Dave radio show. And at a particular time, people had to pay 10 shillings to get a 44-gallon drum of water. There was no running water. People obtained food from the bush to supplement their income. The police didn't allow rifles, but they had hunting dogs with which they could hunt wallabies, goannas, parentes. They had goats for milk. They built thunderbox toilets, and they washed at the nearby creek. When it didn't have water in it, they could dig soakages, and that's where they washed their clothes and bodies. And at the West End, this is the layout of runaway Billy Bismarck's humpy, who was one of the railway fettlers. And from this plan, you can see something of the externally oriented lifestyle, which was a traditional trait. And you can see from this photo here that there was a clothesline made of barbed wire. Pegs weren't required. You can see the ash of the fire hearth. You can see the windbreak and the cubic sleeping shelter. The outside food bench was to keep food out of the reach of dogs and small children, and to protect from the dust. The women were at home during the day, usually played cards with their children. But the children also obtained materials from the local rubbish dump and from the bush to make their amusements and games. Tyres were very popular. Now, another type of settlement pattern that occurred was the idea that what was called a compound. In some of these Western towns, the white citizens complained of the squalor of the fringe camps. So in certain ones during the 1950s, a small area of land was excised from the town common and made a Aboriginal reserve, and on those small areas of land, prefabricated tin sheds were erected for people to live in. So we have Don Rowland's voice here from Birdsville, who introduced me to the compound in Birdsville. And these are some images of his ancestors who he knew as a boy in about 1957 in the Fringe camp there. By 1964, the compound had been built, and you can see there the prefab steel sheds on concrete slabs with visiting nurses. Don became the power operator and remembers when power was connected to these sheds in 1980, and also septic toilets introduced. But by this time, most Fringe camps had been bulldozed in Queensland. The last disappeared in the 1970s. When I went to Birdsville in 1993, the compound was still standing. You can see how far it is from the town proper, because that's the hotel on the right. And they're still there today, somewhat upgraded, but the last of their type. And here we have a map showing where the Boulia compound was, and you can see how that it's some distance out of town. The Boulia compound had 4 of these tin sheds, and sorry, we've jumped forward. There's just a little technical hitch there with the slides. The verandas were had galvanised iron lashed onto them to create. Sorry, this is getting a bit technically unwieldy here. To create outdoor living spaces. Here we're switching to the Camberwell compound. Apologies for the slide switching there. And you can see that there were outhouses, which were usually pit toilets, and one tap, only a couple of taps for the community, and very much out in the open, in cleared spaces with no shade trees. People had to move out every day to find firewood, and of course over the decades the firewood became less and less plentiful in any proximity to these compounds. Oh. Can we switch to the laptop? So this image here is the Normanton compound, and it was probably the most unpleasant of the compounds in Queensland. There were 4 of these large tin sheds. Each tin shed had 10 rooms, which were only about 3 metres square. The internal partitions only went to about 10 centimetres off the ground, so the whole lot could be hosed out. In each room was a family of up to 8 people. When you're lying on the ground, you could see under the partitions to the rooms next door. So there was no privacy. They were very crowded with up to 400 people living here. And it was nicknamed the Black Hole of Normanton. You'll be pleased to know I've got a new method of changing the slides. So this is the next era that I'm going to talk about is the Queensland government's assimilation era, which was from the 1950s. And this was a policy that was accepted for 2 decades all over Australia, but continued in Queensland for longer than that. It said that inmates of reserves attain the same manner of living as other Australians, with the same rights, responsibilities, customs, beliefs and loyalties as the colonising Australians. As the director of the Department of Aboriginal Island Affairs said, "We don't build houses for Aboriginals, we build houses for people. Race doesn't enter into it," which seems an honourable thing to say, but it disguised a very strict and discriminatory act. And one of the first projects was the building of these concrete block cottages at Dejara in the late 60s. And here we have Keith Marshall as a young man in front of one of the cottages after heavy rain. The cottages weren't well designed for the hot climate in Dejara, and at night in summer the walls radiate heat, making it hotter inside the houses than outside, so that it's only natural that people take their beds outside to sleep and maintain their externally oriented lifestyle. Unfortunately, all the cottages are built in a floodplain, and so the Carbine Creek floods the houses every so many years. And this has been the case for the last 50 years. They're still there. However, the more common type of house that became built across the state was what was called by the architects the S1559s and the S1560s. 2 houses for the entire state, despite differences in climates, regional living styles and other factors. One had a veranda at the side and one had a veranda at the front. Sorry. Here we have an aerial view of the Mornington mission, which received some of these ridge houses in the late 60s. And you can see the long line of them beside the road on the left, next to the airstrip on the right. If we look at the plan at the top on the right, again you can see them at the top of the plan in a long line. And to the bottom of on the bottom side of that plan are they self-constructed shelters in the village. The old village was a self-constructed settlement built where there was a trading camp in 1914 when the missionaries arrived. The mission complex is to the left in the bottom corner there. And the people in the village lived on the sand platforms, which was the most comfortable place to live. In the bottom diagram, it's an analysis of what we call the socio-spatial layout, which is how people were clustered into small clusters of shelters according to their clans and extended families. This traditional layout had to be then adapted for the ridge. The reason why the houses were put on the ridge is because the state government developed a new town plan, but it was dictated by the sewage plan. The sewage had to drain inland to processing swamps and tanks, and hence the whole town was eventually moved. Now this is a drawing of the ridge house, and people adapted their beach style by bringing in truckloads of sand to put on the clay, muddy ground of the ridge to simulate a more cleaner outdoor living area. And they lashed pieces of galvanised iron to the posts to create outdoor living spaces protected from the wind where they could build hearths. And so they spent most of their time under the house rather than in the house. This slide shows you how muddy it is in the wet season. And these are the S1560s with the verandas on the front. And a view of Elsie Ruffsey's house again underneath with people in their daytime living area. You can see the sawn off 44-gallon drum there, which is the cooking hearth. People socialising and relaxing. Again, there's Elsie on the left making her dolls beside the house. You can see a galvanised windbreak in the rear with a hearth. On the right, women making traditional string underneath their house. As I said, these were used all over Queensland, irrespective of the climate. On the left, we have one in Boulia, where there's an extreme temperature range in the arid zone. On the right, Arakoon, with a monsoonal climate, very cold winter winds, but very hot, wet summers. And in the Torres Strait, warm, humid climate, same type of design. Now we're going to turn to another type of settlement, a government removal centre. Not all settlements were missions. The government had 4 settlements which we have since now come to call removal centres, because these were administered by government officers, and it's where the government removed people to if they were not useful as labour in the small country towns, or for any other reason that they did not conform to what was required of them. So people were removed to these places for punishment. One of them was at Cherbourg, the others were at Woorabinda, Palm Island and Yarrabah. Palm Island was known as a penal settlement, of course, but they were all penal settlements in one way or another. In the assimilation era, they became places of industrial reform. The assimilation era was reflected a logic that Aboriginal people were no longer dying out, and hence the protection terminology was no longer required. But they had to be assimilated now that their population was growing, and acquire the lifestyle of working class people. Cherbourg had a sawmill and a prefabricated cottage and joinery industry. The prefabricated timber cottages were manufactured and exported to other Aboriginal communities around the state. And other things such as timber joinery, earth closet chambers, outhouses, and fence palings, other timber components were all manufactured here for these typical timber cottages, which ranged in floor area from 20 square metres to 40 square metres, and which were installed throughout many parts of the state and provided manual training for many of the people. But people still personalised these little cottages in a very distinctive way. And here we find some photos by the film director Bruce Beresford for the film The Fringe Dweller, or The Fringe Dwellers that he made. Now, the political policies of the federal government changed after the referendum in 1968, and when the Commonwealth was given the right to take over providing some services for Aboriginal people in Australia. And their policies went in an opposite way to Queensland's policies. Whereas the Queensland Director of Aboriginal and Island Affairs chose to maintain the assimilation policy, the Commonwealth introduced a quite different approach and encouraged the practice of Aboriginal culture and encouraged people to identify with their culture. And for the first time, it became a requirement for meaningful consultation to be carried out with Aboriginal people on their needs and priorities. And so we find a dual system of Aboriginal service provision arose in order to bypass the political blockages in states and their racist assimilationist policies that were continuing. And part of this was to set up housing societies programs, housing association schemes, whereby people could set up a housing co-op and the Commonwealth could fund money very quickly with minimal bureaucratic fuss to these small co-ops around the state. The first one we're going to look at is at Cloncurry, where there was a fringe camp in the early 1970s. And here we have the artist, Gordon Hookie's voice. He's identifying who's living in this particular example, his auntie and uncle at Coppermine Creek. And you can see people personalised their houses and had all the mod cons in these fringe camp houses. They were by no means unhygienic. They were quite well kept and clean. But people still maintained an externally oriented lifestyle, and they had a degree of autonomy in these fringe camps that they couldn't acquire on mission reserves. And here we have at this time, although it was about to be bulldozed, the fringe camp, we have probably one of the most successful co-ops in Australia under the guidance of a Reverend Alan Lanham, who was both a builder and a clergyman, and he trained the people to build their own concrete block houses. And here's the specification, which is quite short, very short in fact, but included some innovative things. Solar hot water systems. No other Aboriginal house in Queensland at this stage had a solar hot water system. And the people did such a good job of building these houses, they became well publicised and photographed by the Commonwealth Government photographer. And here we have Elder Pearl Connolly's voice identifying her grandmother and where her relatives still live today in these houses. But this is taken in 1974, and again these are taken in 1974, and you can see how proud people were and how well they've set up their houses and enjoying living in them. Now switching to another co-op, the Jimbarella co-op in Dejara. At this time, co-ops had a number of options as to how they procured houses. Some of them chose to use an architect. In this case, there was an architect. The houses were very small. They became known as the opera houses. And again, we have Keith Marshall's voice talking. He's pointing out here a problem with collecting rain in 44-gallon drums off these diagonal corners of the roof and the difficulty it gave. But the issue here was that when you had a small budget, a co-op might only be able to afford a 3-bedroom house with that budget, but they might have had another option of getting 4 small houses, as in this case, or perhaps 8 tin sheds for the same amount of money. And they might have chosen to spread the money and thereby give a greater number of people some sort of accommodation than just provided to one family. And so with these small houses, again, lifestyle became very externally oriented. But that was a traditional custom. People were used to that. And here Keith's sitting with a resident in 2007 at one of these houses. They're still existing. And Ronnie has his windbreaks for cold south wind time and a bough shed for hot summer months and cooks on a fire. Another type of acquisition method, not so common in this case at Dejara, was where there was a partnership set up with the local TAFE college. And the TAFE tradesmen trained the Aboriginal young men in the community to build these prefab kit houses. And then the trainees were able to rent these houses. And that was again another successful project. A more common way to obtain houses by co-ops was transportable houses trucked in from the east coast or the south coast, as the case might be. And this is one particular example in Dejara, but one of the problems with these transportable houses is they were often not climatically suitable and not culturally appropriate for the lifestyles of these people in these rural towns. Now, another important co-op in Queensland has been the North Stradbroke Island Housing Co-op. And here we have a photo of the board in 1995. It was originally formed in 1973 by Kath Walker, as she was known then, before she changed her name to Udjuru Nunakal, the well-known author. And like many of these co-ops in Queensland, they had a very broad constitution. Not only provided housing, but a great range of services were provided. And in this case, there was aged care services, childcare services, there was a rangers program, to name just a few. Note the lady second from the top, Margaret Kujerik. She's still alive and still with the co-op. And here we have a view inside the co-op office. So you can get the idea that the co-op is like a museum for the community and a very important social centre and cultural centre, celebrating the achievements of the co-op over the last 55 years. And here, one of the few architect-designed houses that the co-op has, a set of flats at Dunwich, designed by an architect called Paul Memmott. And here we have the resident photographed last year explaining how she enjoys being close to the Moreton Bay with its cooling sea breezes and the abundance of bird life that she listens to. Now, one of the aspects of the new Commonwealth policies in the 1970s was to encourage people, as I said, to practice their cultures. Not only were things established like the Aboriginal Arts Board, dance theatres, cultural centres, arts organisations, dot painting in Central Australia flourished, but outstations were encouraged. People were allowed to move back onto country and build houses on their countries if they could access their land. And although this was not as prolific in Queensland as in the Northern Territory, there were some places where it did occur. And here we have some examples of an outstation at Lockhart River in the early 1990s, where people again built their houses out of second-hand materials or low-cost prefab sheds and lived their preferred externally oriented lifestyles. Also, the Commonwealth Government in the 1970s set up a thing called the Aboriginal Housing Panel attached to the Institute of Architects to provide a pool of architects around the continent for those communities who wanted some sort of particularly special type of design developed. And some communities who were still living very semi-sedentary lives had asked for small prefabricated type shelters that could be portable or movable. This particular one was called the Girraween Shelter, designed by a Cairns architect, Eddie Orobin, and was used in outstations outside of Arakoon. And here we can see one assembled at Perrott Outstation, 1976. Now, something that happened to disrupt the pattern of the Queensland State Government's provision of the two standard types across the state was the impact of cyclones. There was a particular cyclone that we could outline at Edward River and Mitchell River, now known as Pomperau and Coanyama, in 1964. That was Cyclone Dora. But I'm going to take you back to Mornington Island for Cyclone Ted in 1976. And you can see there the destruction of, on the left, the standard S1559s and S1560 ridge houses. For the first time, the government used prefabricated housing, and they developed what was called a performance specification, which included the need to withstand cyclonic-proof winds for any prefabricated housing solution. There was a design wind speed, and the design had to be certified by an engineer that the house would stand up according to that wind speed. And the houses in this case were modular, steel frame, panel construction on slabs and low set floors. I was involved with the design of these, and we did manage to make some achievements. We managed to convince the Director of the Aboriginal Affairs Department to widen some of the verandas to 3 metres wide to allow for more externally oriented daytime living. We persuaded the government to introduce solar hot water systems and also timber windscreens on the verandas for cold southeast winds to improve the climatic performance. At Burketown, we had one house with 2 toilets for a large household, which was a radical breakthrough at that time to be able to design for a large household, because the earlier standards were all designed for standard working class family with either 2 or 3 bedrooms. But there was still a rigid assimilationist mentality coming from the director that made it difficult for the ethical consciousness of the architect who was trying to design for appropriate, culturally appropriate lifestyles and climatic needs. So despite all of these various government attempts at housing, we find that there was a persistence of outdoor living and other types of traditional domiciliary behaviours in communities all over Queensland. And here we have a case of one of these post-cyclone Ted prefab houses at Mornington Island, completed in 1978. And the Aboriginal elder moves into this house on the left, his two Aboriginal wives, their children and grandchildren, and he himself builds a windbreak across the road, which becomes his men's camp, where he entertains and socialises with visiting men and manufactures various types of artefacts for sale at the store. If he needs his clothes washed, or if he needs to get food from the fridge or have a shower, he simply crosses the road to his family house. Crossing back to Dejara, Keith Marshall's telling us this is his house, called the Pine Trees, his family house, well known for its all day and all night card games, and here with its outdoor kitchen and outdoor sleeping area. Another Dejara house, Joy Dempsey's yard, again with windbreaks and outdoor recreating areas. And Ruby Dusachi's house, with a bough shed for day and night time resting and sleeping. And here we have the voice of Charles Passy, whose father, Dave Passy, was one of the litigants in the Mabo case. But Charles is saying the house is mainly for shelter and is disposable in our traditional custom. And behind this house, between this house and the beach, we find the outdoor living areas. And here is cousins and cousin brothers on the beach or on the sand platform facing the beach, observing the sea. And the women in another adjacent living area facing the sea, manufacturing their traditional artefacts from palm leaves and pandanus leaves. Now, crossing back to Stradbroke Island, we go to the case of the 1 Mile at Dunwich. Here we have respected Elder Uncle Bob Anderson, who gave us permission to show his granny's house, photographed in the 1930s. His granny, Mary Rose Tripkini, who was one of those matriarchs of the Quandamooka Society that I mentioned, who was formerly at Myora. And she had her house moved from there to what's called the 1 Mile. The 1 Mile was 1 mile from the asylum, and it's where the labour pool was for the asylum. The asylum had something like 400 people, I think, and needed a large group of labourers and domestics to keep it maintained and working. So there was a population of up to 180 people at the 1 Mile, Aboriginal people. And there was no formal land tenure. There was a mixture of tin sheds and self-constructed shacks. People were trying to get funding for housing from the government, but the government refused based on its assimilation policy. Eventually in 1946 the asylum was relocated to Sandgate. The area was then surveyed as the town Dunwich. The 1 Mile remained, the families remained. The families continued to persistently try to get the government to provide funding for housing, and the government refused. And a socio-spatial pattern evolved over these many decades, whereby different families occupied different areas at the 1 Mile. And here we have a small low-cost house with a reference to Juno, one of those original wives of Fernando at Amity, indicating this area is occupied by her descendants. And in fact, if you drive into the 1 Mile, most houses have the name of their family group on a particular design sign. And here we have one of the residents, Dale, better known as Dugong Ruska, who was one of the leaders in the 1 Mile Residents Aboriginal Corporation. He started as an apprentice carpenter in 1984, and he even worked on those flats that I showed that were built in 1989. But since living on the 1 Mile, he's assisted with not only his own house here, but building many other houses for the other residents and helping them build their houses. Most of these houses on the 1 Mile have very large verandas, reflecting the need for their external orientation and orientated to the sea. And here we have his outdoor living area, a paved area where he entertains and has barbecues, and where he sits and yarns and meets people. And his neighbour is Brian Coggle, better known as Beaver. Again, he used recycled materials and built the house himself, bringing in qualified tradesmen, including Dale, as needed. And his next project is a house for his son, which will combine solar and wind power. Now, at the 1 mile, there's no land tenure, there's no building lots or surveyed land. All of these houses, apart from the power supply, are self-sustaining. So they're putting into effect sustainability in their designs. They're way ahead of the game. Brian was originally one of the community rangers, selected by Kath Walker to be trained and managed to protect country, and was quite important in the native title claim. Now we're coming to the conclusion, so I'm quickly jumping over the early 2000 period to jump to this image from The Australian, taken a few weeks ago at Yarrabah, where there was this publicity about the COVID surge. And here we're highlighting the fact that many people in our state, Indigenous people, are living in very crowded housing. This lady has something like 22 grandchildren and it's a total of about 40 children and grandchildren across 2 houses, and she has an average of 13 people in her house at any one time. One of her sons has rheumatic heart disease, and caught COVID when this story was done. But she chose to keep her son in 1 bedroom in the house to ensure that he had the best care. But it raises a serious issue about a number of things. Firstly, as I mentioned, high crowding in housing, which can often have an average of, in a community, can often have an average of 10 people per house. And for those who watched the Four Corners program at Doomadgee last Monday night, we see another typical case from our state. One of the problems of living in crowded houses is that on these beds you might have 2 or 3 children sleeping together, and that is how skin infections and respiratory infections are passed on. School sores are passed on and referred to in the medical world as streptococcal A infection. And by continually sleeping in this way and transforming households due to residential mobility patterns, we find children continually get reinfected with these types of skin and respiratory infections, whereby their immune system is gradually suppressed as they grow older, and they become susceptible to rheumatic heart disease and rheumatic fever, and die, as at Doomadgee, at the age of 19 or in their early 20s. But worse still, that depression of that immune system can then lead into chronic kidney illness and death by kidney failure in their 20s. So the issues are still very critical for housing in Queensland. And we are still looking to more and better housing for First Nations people. And I think I'll just bring that to an end now. The key message being there are a lot of positive things to take away about local self-governance and good practice achievements and cultural persistence in Indigenous Queensland, but there's still many negative features which need to be addressed, covering things like poverty and ill health, crowding, unemployment and so forth. So I'll throw it open to questions or comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was great. We do have a very topical question, which is from Toby Chambers. And he writes, with the most recent flooding and bushfires in mind, does Australian society with European influence of private property ownership need to adapt to a more traditional nomadic indigenous lifestyle?
Well, that's an interesting question. A more obvious one is, if people are going to get Lismore rebuilt by the government, why aren't the cottage dwellers in Dejara getting their village rebuilt after 50 years of flooding? And what's happening in the outer Torres Straits with the flooding of the low-lying islands there, where people have been shouting for years about the impact of climate change. And these aren't private houses, they're rental government houses that we're talking about.
So it's not actually specific to anything which has been happening recently, it's the patterns throughout the country.
As for private houses, I mean, as an architect, I believe in having a house that suits your lifestyle. So one of the points that I've been subtly trying to make out is that there's been a failure to show much interest in designing houses for Aboriginal people's lifestyles in the history of our housing provision in the state. But it's up to private owners to choose whatever lifestyles they wish. And of course, along with that goes a passive climatic design housing, which uses the minimal energy and has the least embodied energy in its materials. So choosing particular materials and particular heating and cooling systems in houses, whether they be passive or solar or wind driven energy, is the way to go. The bushfire issue is another one which needs to be carefully taken into account, and that's one of the issues at the 1 mile at Stradbroke, that they're very close to areas which are subject to bushfires, and certainly they're very mindful of that, and into making windbreaks, fire breaks, etc. So that's a good question.
Because there, I remember doing some research on Peel Island many years ago and seeing the stark contrast. So the old lazarette or leprosarium, and seeing the stark contrast between the European housing, which was weatherboard cottages and such, and the Aboriginal precinct, which was completely segregated and being made of tin and bark and the like, but in one way that actually being more suitable for the environment, even though the weatherboard cottages cost many thousands of pounds more.
Yes. Well, they're not as durable, and it's possible. Like, there's a particular approach to designing a house that's been tried over the last 50 years, which is what we call a decentralised house. So we have a number of different living spaces with different types of materials in a living space, such that there might be daytime summer living area, daytime winter living area, nighttime winter living area, nighttime summer area, and even a men's area and a women's area. It's gender specific, which is the case in many Aboriginal communities still. So that there's a sort of a decentralised cluster of buildings. There's still some interest in that in various communities. The lazarette, it highlights another issue which, politically there's a lot of politics under the surface of this talk, and which I haven't really brought out, but you've alluded to truth telling, and part of the problem in the 1970s is that the Department of Aboriginal and Island Affairs was channeling a lot of the Commonwealth's money. The Commonwealth was sending money through under the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement for Aboriginal housing, but the money was being spent on staff housing. And so people were still living in those sort of... When I went to Aurukun in 1975, some people were still living in those bark-clad houses that had been built in the 1910s and 1920s. And the staff were living in S1559s and S1560s. So it highlights, I'm sure it was worse on on Peel Island, but it highlights this disparity and inequity in the history of Aboriginal housing in not only Queensland, Australia. And the fact, like when Gough Whitlam got in to Parliament, he said he was going to house all Aboriginal people within 10 years. And the backlog has never been met. And there is still a severe backlog of housing to adequately house Indigenous people or First Nations people in an equitable way with non-Indigenous people. And no government will face up to the task of doing it.
Yeah, it's almost as though the challenge is beyond them, or they're not wanting to.
And they wonder why the Aboriginal health is getting so bad. And this is, I've turned my energies into the issues of the health and thrown my hat in with various people in the medical profession to look at this issue of crowding leading through to chronic kidney failure and death in one's 20s.
Yeah, it's all linked, isn't it? Yeah. Look, I think that's it for the questions. So I think we might wrap it up there. So
thanks for giving me the opportunity to put that out there. I think it's important history that people need to know about it. It's been quite a quick, superficial run across what happened in the state, but it gives people a visual idea of what the conditions have been like in Queensland.
And hope they keep improving. So thanks everyone for tuning in today, and we hope you enjoyed the talk from Paul, and stay in touch with State Archives and on our socials and our websites, and see when the next QSA talk is, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks very much.